All right, I'm Kelly Lindsay, and today I'll be talking about survivors of sexual violence. To quickly summarize some health concerns for this population, they're at risk for communicable diseases such as STIs, non-communicable diseases or conditions such as unwanted pregnancy, injuries, some chronic conditions, asthma, headaches, difficulty sleeping, and mental health conditions that they're at risk for are PTSD, anxiety, depression, substance abuse, suicidal and self-harm tendencies, smoking and other risky activities, risky sexual behaviors, and poor coping mechanisms. The media can inaccurately portray sexual violence often. This usually includes victim blaming. Language is a contributing factor to this. For example, using sex instead of rape or sexual assault, saying engaged in instead of was forced to. Those are just a couple examples. Media also victim blames by focusing on behaviors such as flirting or substance use. Victim blaming by the media often leads to re-victimization of survivors, so re-victimization and fear of being blamed for the assault can cause survivors to avoid reporting, and as a consequence, they don't seek out recovery services. Family support can be a pretty big factor for survivors' recovery. It can either really help their recovery or hinder it. When family and friends respond positively to a survivor when they talk about their assault, they can feel like they're believed, and they're often encouraged to seek out resources. Family members can, other than just believing a survivor, they can impact their recovery by listening, providing a safe place for them to stay, offering to take them to appointments, and just continue to remind them that it's not their fault what happened to them and it doesn't define them. And like I just said, if a family member has a negative reaction, it can increase the likelihood of PTSD, depression, anxiety, problem drinking, lower self-worth, and lower self-esteem. Similar to family support, peers can have a positive or negative impact on a survivor's recovery based on positive or negative reactions. Some peer groups, this is often seen in college campuses, but peer groups that have a rape supportive culture can lead to sexual aggression from males and sexual assault perpetration by males and female victimization. There's definitely a cyclical nature to sexual assault. Nearly 50% of childhood sexual abuse survivors experience re-victimization later in life. This is definitely a higher rate of re-victimization than someone who was first assaulted as an adult. Some childhood sexual abuse victims have a higher risk of violence perpetration later in adulthood, especially females. Childhood sexual abuse and re-victimization is associated with higher rates of PTSD, substance use disorders, and other mental and emotional disorders. The legal and political system for survivors of sexual assault can be used for seeking justice or protection orders, financial assistance. In the case when assault is by a spouse, the legal system might be used to obtain child custody. As few as 5 to 20% of survivors actually report their assault to law enforcement. More than 50% of survivors that report to law enforcement say that the experience wasn't helpful or sometimes it was harmful. Only 30% of reporters say that the experience with law enforcement and the legal system actually helped their recovery. Stereotypical assaults are more likely to be reported, such as stranger assault, violent assaults, and assaults that don't include substance use. The opposite of that would be survivors who experience assaults that may be seen as their fault, and they're more likely to be blamed for it, such as ones that use substance abuse or by an intimate partner that type of thing. Many survivors who experience negative responses from law enforcement, a lot of those responses are victim blaming and not being believed when they talk about their assault. They also may fear retaliation of the perpetrator and avoid reporting to law enforcement because of that. The differences between local, state, and national, there weren't a ton of local differences that I could find. It mostly occurs at the state level. States have different laws regarding what is even defined as rape and assault, what penalties are, what is defined as consent, and lots of different things. Not all states have the same protections or resources for sexual assault survivors. For example, some states have a Bill of Rights laws for survivors, others don't. Nationally, there is a Bill of Rights for sexual assault survivors, which applies to cases that occur across state lines, military cases, and assaults that occur in a federal prison or any other federal lands. Some potential cultural barriers. Rape myths are a big problem for survivors of sexual assault. Usually they're the result of gender norms and an acceptance of violence as the norm in societies. They lead a lot to victim blaming. Men are more likely to accept and support rape myths than females. Some examples of these myths are, if she doesn't fight back, then she wasn't really raped, or if a person enjoyed it, then they weren't actually sexually assaulted. Rape only happens to certain types of women. Those are just a few examples. There's many more. Some other stigmas, especially in heteronormative cultures, can impact male survivors, such as they're less likely to report and seek resources because of shame and fear of being stereotyped as weak, inadequate, and homosexual. Internationally, rape myths are varied by country. For example, in the US, the culture is less likely to accept rape myths than other countries such as Japan and India. The US is also less likely to accept and support partner violence than countries such as Nigeria. Sexual violence is more likely to occur in countries that are less developed and of lower and middle incomes. Many women and girls are subject to female genital mutilation, which occurs in at least 31 countries, half of which are in West Africa. In 2017, 50,000 women around the world were killed by an intimate partner or family member. Most of these occurred in Africa and Asia. Health disparities among socioeconomic status, so it can definitely impact a survivor's physical and mental health. Children living in poverty are more likely to be victims of sexual violence. This is typically associated with factors such as higher risk of victimization from negative parenting, family stress, mental illness, material hardships, and irregular employment can all contribute to that increased risk. Survivors of sexual violence are also at risk for economic impacts after an act of violence due to medical and recovery expenses, and even from having to take time off of work to recover. There are disparities among different races and ethnicities for survivors of sexual assault. So African American women experience more negative responses when they report sexual assaults than white American women, especially from law enforcement and healthcare providers. Some rape myths are specific to African American and Latinas. So African American women are more promiscuous, or Latinas are seen as hypersexual and passionate, leading to more victim blaming. Let's see, African American survivors are more likely to use informal support systems, so friends, family, spirituality, or religion instead of formal support such as law enforcement and healthcare. Survivors of racial and ethnic minorities are less likely to have their cases prosecuted. And this was interesting. So the intersection of race and sexual orientation can also greatly impact the recovery of sexual assault. So this was particularly seen with Black women of sexual minorities. So LGBT Black women are more likely to have difficulty recovering from sexual assaults. I couldn't find a ton of information about how religion affects the health outcomes of survivors. I did find some study that showed that survivors who are already highly active in religion and they use religion to cope, they had a positive outcome after their sexual assault. And I also saw some research that said male survivors of sexual violence are more likely to not report due to religious taboos. Health disparities among genders. So males experience a higher rate of negative responses when they report their sexual violence compared to women. If their reporting of sexual assault is delayed, women experience more negative impacts on their mental health than men. Female childhood sexual abuse survivors are at a higher risk for re-victimization than male childhood sexual abuse survivors. Also with the female childhood abuse survivors, they're at a higher risk of substance use disorders, emotional disorders, and PTSD after abuse. They also have a higher risk of becoming a perpetrator compared to the males. Geographical location was primarily due to or seen in rural locations. And there were geographical factors, and I added in kind of some social structure factors that I saw in rural areas. So in rural areas, they are further from resources. They may also have a lack of resources, such as lack of available transportation to, say, a healthcare provider or mental health recovery services. And they also have fewer SANE nurses. So overall, less resources or a more difficult time accessing them. And then social structures in rural areas. This one I can definitely attest to because I'm a SANE in a rural area. One barrier is a lack of privacy and confidentiality in rural areas. Bias for survivors of sexual violence, so it can be implicit or explicit. Gender bias can definitely affect the reactions to survivors. See, I have. So for example, an implicit bias for males and females. So drinking and substance use is often seen as acceptable for male perpetration. When it's in the context of females using alcohol, for example, it's used as a cause for victim blaming. Females are often experience victim blaming more, and they're disbelieved more. They're more harshly judged by their lifestyle, appearance, reputation, and demeanor. Bias may also impact survivors who have physical or cognitive disabilities, so they are less likely to be believed when they talk about sexual assault because of an implicit bias that they're not sexual. Gender stereotypes and bias against sexual assault and domestic violence can also be present in many professions, particularly law enforcement, which can result in discrimination by police, particularly against LGBT women of color, kind of like I mentioned before. An example of explicit bias is the language you use. So using the label victim may imply that they are unable to cope, passive, vulnerable, compared to the label survivor, which may imply an ability to cope and strength. Internationally, child sexual abuse, female genital mutilation, intimate partner violence, and non-partner violence are associated with worse health outcomes in low and middle income countries. More developed countries have more effective preventative and recovery